Hey there, guys, and welcome to this month's Thriller of the Month. So, my Thriller of the Month this month is Bright Lies by A. Abbott. This story follows a young girl called Emily who meets a man called David who turns her life around when he marries her mother. David is a wealthy artist and he teaches Emily how to really embrace her skills as an artist, and she begins to flourish. Then, sadly, David begins teaching Emily things that a 12-year-old girl shouldn't really know. And it spirals from there until Emily is 15 years old and she decides that for her own safety, she must run away from this family home. She is then rescued from the streets by a young DJ called Jack, who doesn't really know that Emily is 15 when he takes her into his home. And he also doesn't know that she is hiding secrets of her past, secrets that can really jeopardize his future. I really enjoyed this story. For starters, I want to take you through the content warnings before you continue, because it's important to really get those out there so you know exactly what you're getting into before we go in. There are content warnings for this book, very serious. There is paedophilia, child grooming, physical assault, rape, drug and alcohol abuse. There is a lot of content warnings for this story. It's very deep, it's very dark, and it really goes to some terrible places. So if you have any sort of content warnings in relation to those things, it might be best that you don't continue this video, or if you do continue, maybe definitely proceed with caution. So this story, I love this. I thought it was written so well. I'm going to take you through the writing first. I thought A. Abbott wrote this in a way that got the story across in its truest form. You got to see not only the horror, but you got to see how easy it was for David to manipulate everybody around him. You got to see how it was for him to manipulate Emily. You got to see how easy it was for him to manipulate Emily's mum. You got to see how easy it was for him to manipulate everything in these people's lives to just isolate Emily and make him her own. For example, near the start of the book, David marries Emily's mother, and the story follows Emily and her mother moving into David's house. What that entails is Emily being forced to leave her friends and everything she knew behind, which really did isolate her from the start. And you could clearly see that, and that was the worst thing, that you could see it, but as a reader, you're powerless to help. So it really took you through those emotions. And I think it was just so well written that it didn't feel as though anything was written in for shock value. It didn't feel as though it was put in to really show the true horrors. This is how it is. We're not going to sugarcoat it. We're not going to do this. You have to see this, and it's terrifying. It wasn't written like that. But at the same time, it wasn't written on the flip side, where it was kind of veiled as romance. Oh, I love him, it was okay kind of thing. It wasn't written in a way where it was kind of sugar-coated either. It had that really, really perfect balance of, this is dark, this is twisted, you can see how terrible it is, but I'm showing you from a perspective of somebody who can see the manipulation. And that's what it was. You got to see this manipulation, which I really enjoyed, because I don't think I've ever read a story such as this where you could see the manipulation so clearly and it wasn't too late when you could see it. As a reader, you noticed the signs, and it did a really good job of allowing people to learn and recognize these signs. So if it ever happened in life, you could be aware of that. And I thought that was excellent. Now, moving on to the characters. I thought the character of Emily was a great girl. I thought her character was really well developed, well rounded. You really got to see the different stages of her relationships with people. So it started out with her having crushes on people from One Direction. She even mentions that David looks like one of the people in One Direction. And you really got to see the child in Emily. You got to see her having an interest in art. You got to see her messing around with her best friend and talking about the crushes from One Direction and things like that. And then you saw how that changed over time. She met David, she introduced him to her mother. She still had that childhood innocence, and then you got to see her have to grow up a little bit when she was forced to move away. She had to go to a new school, therefore she had to leave everything she knew behind, which from a reader's perspective you could see how isolating that was, but not at the same time. You could see how people would miss that that was an isolating incident. You could see how people would say he's trying to do what's best for her, he's trying to help her, that he's helping the family. Whereas in reality, when you know what's happening, you can also see that him doing that could have easily been a manipulation technique to say, I don't want her to have friends, I don't want her to be with people, because if she ever has friends, she could tell people about this. And that was terrifying. It was horrible to read, but I loved it to read because it was so clear. And as someone, for me personally, who studied a lot of psychology, I still do for continuing professional development, I still find it quite interesting. It was really interesting and eye-opening to read, and David did that so well, but so subtly. And I think you really got to see their relationship grow, because Emily went from this young girl to having to grow up a little bit to impress when she goes to a new school and try and make her new friends. And you got to see David trying to support her in ways that were quite manipulative. Because David had money, he almost manipulated the mother by buying her things, like sending her on a spa weekend because she's had a busy time. He put the mother in a very uncomfortable position with her work, and that is ultimately what leads Emily to having to run away, because she knows that David's put her in this impossible position where if she does anything, not only will it affect her life now, it will destroy her mother's life. It could really risk her mother's safety and well-being, as well as her emotional state of finding out that the man she is married to has abused her daughter. So you could really see why Emily made the decision she did. You could really see how easy it was for everybody in their lives to be manipulated by David. And I just thought that was so well written. So let's move on a little bit to the character of Jack. Now, when Emily runs away, she is rescued by a boy called Jack. Emily is on the streets, and Jack finds her and takes her into his home because he wants to make sure that she is kept safe. What Jack doesn't know is that Emily is only 15 years old at the time, and therefore taking her into his home is actually quite a big risk. Jack was such a lovely character. I really felt for him the entire way through this story. It starts out with Jack being really dealt the wrong hand in life. He is treated in a way by his family. They just make assumptions about him. They just assume he has anger issues because of previous experiences that we learn about. And Jack has anger issues, and that leads his family to assume that one day he's just going to end up in prison, and he's not really worth their time to try and help and support. So Jack is forced to basically leave his house, and he ends up with nowhere to go, nowhere to live, and he tries to set up his own life with his own friends. He's got his own job, and he really tries to make a life for himself. And all the way through, you rooted for him. I know I did. I was personally sat there wanting everything in his life to just work out and go to plan, because after being treated so badly by his family and having his family tell him that they just didn't think he was ever going to amount to anything, so he had to leave, it really hurt me for him, and I really wanted him to be okay. So when you got to see him do well, it was amazing, but it also really allowed you to see the risk, what he was taking in Emily, which was hard because he didn't know she was a child, so he wasn't taking the risk. Emily does tell him that she is a bit older to avoid being left in the street. But you could really understand the characters, and that is the thing I'm going to say. That is just my closing argument for these characters, because I loved Jack with a passion. I thought Emily was such a well-developed character, and I thought, as much as I hated David with a passion, I felt as though he was written perfectly, because you could see the manipulation that he was doing throughout this entire story, as well as the fact that you could see how easy it was for people to be taken in by him. But what I will say about these characters is that you could truly understand their motivations from the very first page. And you understood why Emily lied to Jack. You understood why Jack wanted to help her as well as not have anyone be in control of his life. You could understand where their characters were coming from. And that was what I loved, because I never felt as though I didn't like any of them. I never felt as though I was really struggling to connect to these characters, because you couldn't struggle. You knew and you felt everything. One of my personal content warnings is actually to do with child grooming, paedophilia, because due to my work, I have experienced those situations with children I have seen in my line of work, and it's really, really upsetting. And one of the things I have always struggled with is reading about it in books, because I feel as though I've seen it in my daily life. I don't need it in my escape, which is what I use books for personally. I use them to forget about the problems of life. If I've had a stressful day at work, I will read a book. If I've had a stressful day with my family, I will read a book. If I have had just a long day, I'm tired and I'm exhausted, I will read a book, because that's what I do. And I think that's what a lot of people do. So seeing those horrors in my life and through my work, and then having to read about it, it's not really a thing for me. So I was really surprised when I started reading this, and I loved it, and I got to the end. Because this year I've read quite a few books, actually. Not that many, but about, I think, three books with similar themes. I read Don't Tell Mummy, which I despised. I finished it, but I despised it. And then I read My Dark Vanessa, which I DNF'd because I couldn't handle the topic. And then Sleepers by Lorenzo Carcaterra, which I ended up DNF because it was the same topic and I couldn't handle it. So when I picked this one up and I realised this is what it was about, I panicked a little bit. But it was written so well that I actually made it through the book. And not only did I make it through, you're here. You can see I loved the story and I thought it was so well written. I gave this story a 4-star, but that was my initial feelings. I feel as though, realistically, I should or could have given this book a 5-star rating. The only reason I didn't is because those feelings that I got from reading about child grooming, etc., was very difficult for me to comprehend. I was not loving that part of the book because it is one of my personal things. So I ended up giving it a 4-star because obviously my enjoyment of the story was kind of stopped a little bit. But I finished this story, it was about 5 or 6 days ago now, and I've been thinking about it non-stop. I thought about this book at least once every day, and I think that's great. So I think what I'm going to do, because I originally gave this a 4-star because of my lack of enjoyment, I personally couldn't give it a 5-star because I did have those negative feelings at some points because of my personal warnings. I'm going to give this book a 4.5. I'm going to bump it up because I love this story. If you can handle these themes, I would honestly recommend checking out this story because I think it is just so beautifully written. It doesn't sugarcoat it. It doesn't just shock you with the horror. It is written with such a perfect balance that you can understand everyone's motivation. You could understand how easy it was for things to happen. And overall, it was just a really nice story to read. And that's where this psychological thriller aspect comes in, because this is not a thriller in its traditional sense. This is a thriller because of how real it can be. I wasn't on the edge of my seat panicking about what's going to happen next and trying to unmask this mysterious person or anything like that. That's not what this story was about. This story was a thriller, and it was terrifying and horrifying in its own unique way because of how real this is. You know these characters. You know them in your daily life. They're written so truthfully. And sadly, we know these experiences. We've seen them in movies. We've seen them on the news frequently. We may have even experienced them in our lives with people we know. It's horrendous to think about, and that's where the thriller aspect comes in for me. It's not going to be keeping you on the edge of your seat thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? But it is going to make you sit there and think, it breaks my heart that this happens, because it does. And we really get to see how in this book. It's not a case of trying to give you the nitty-gritty details of what happens. It tells you about how this happens and how easy it is for it to happen. And that's what will stay with you, because that is what stayed with me. But it was a great story, and I really, really enjoyed it. It featured themes that I am not comfortable with, and I still loved it. If you can handle these, then I would definitely recommend giving this a go. If you will struggle with any of these content warnings, then either proceed with a lot of caution, or maybe this is not a book for you. If you would like to know any more about these content warnings, for example, how heavily they feature or how graphic some scenes are, please feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy to have that discussion with you, because I think it's important to know exactly what you're letting yourself in for before you go into a book such as this. But other than that, guys, this is my thriller of the month. I will leave a link below to the Amazon page where you can buy a copy of this book. So I would 100% recommend checking out this book. Like I said, please be aware of content warnings, because they're very heavy in this book, and I think it's important to know what you're getting yourself in for. But other than that, guys, that is my thriller of the month, and that is it from me. So leave me a comment down below if you fancy reading this book, because it would be lovely to see that some people are now wanting to give this book a go. If you want to leave me a comment but you're not really in the right headspace, maybe, that's absolutely fine. Or maybe you just don't want to leave a comment, that is absolutely fine. But if you do fancy leaving a comment and you don't really want to type anything, that is absolutely fine. Just leave me a butterfly or a moth down in the comments below, just so I know you've been here, because it is lovely to see who has come to watch my thriller of the month, because it is one of my favourite videos to film each month, and I really do appreciate every single person that comes and watches this. Other than that, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you give me a like and make sure you subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.
SafeMusicList.com, royalty-free music for marketing and promotional videos.